Lately I've been making lots of things for my workshop, and I thought it was about time I kept my wife Kath happy and make something for her. So in this video I'm going to make a dining table. The one we have is okay, but we've had it for years and I think we could do with something a bit nicer. So here's the design I came up with, and I'll start with the center panel, which has a tiled pattern. It'll be a Kumiko style pattern, but instead of making a grid, it'll be made from tiles. This template shows the size of the tile, and I can use up these small pieces of camphor laurel that I usually use in my scrapwood challenge projects. I'll start by planing one face, then because some of the pieces are pretty skinny, I'm not too keen to plane those on the jointer, so instead I just quickly made this jig to do that more safely on the table saw. This is also a good option if you don't have a jointer, and also the first operation could also be done using a jig on the table saw. I made a video on that a few years ago and I'll put a link above. After they've been through the thicknesser, I'll start cutting strips which will be 3mm or 1/8 of an inch thick. I need about 500 tiles and I think I have just enough strips to make them. To make the tiles, I've put together this sled. It only took 10 minutes to make and it'll let me cut the tiles accurately and safely. I'll cut off the end of the strip first and then I'll flip it to make another 30-degree cut. This will be the finished tile, and to keep them even, I'll set a stop by pushing the strip up against the block. I could have made a built-in stop, but the tile would have been trapped between the stop and the blade. This way I can just flick it out the way when it's cut. After I cut so many, I did a test to see how accurate they are. They won't be used exactly like this, and they don't actually need to be quite this precise, but the more accurate they are, the easier it will be to line the pattern up. Now I'll get into it and cut the rest. I can't remember quite how long they took, but I think it was a few hours. I've cut a piece of very flat quality marine plywood off camera, and now I'll start sticking the tiles to it. I'll work the pattern from the centre, so I'll mark that first. Some of you who've been watching my channel over the years will probably recognise quite a few past projects showing up in this video. I'm not quite sure how many, but for a bit of fun, see how many you can see. I did see quite a few though, including this brass hammer that's been getting a lot of use lately. And by the way, there's still a few available to buy if you're interested. I'll put a link in the description, and as always, I really appreciate your support. There's too many tiles to clamp or weigh down individually, so I'll just press down on them for a few seconds, which I'm hoping will create a good enough bond. I'm leaving a gap between the tiles, which will later get filled in with epoxy. To space them, I'll use some of the waste pieces from the ends of the strips. This is going to take some time, but I reckon it's enjoyable enough work, so I'll get into it and put an audiobook on. When I get so many tiles down, I can remove the spaces from previous tiles, as I don't want the spaces to get glued in there. I noticed I was already going off, so to keep things on track, I've drawn a line along the row to work to, and I've also put some wax on the spaces. I've started to weigh down the tiles as I move along to give them more chance of sticking. If the odd corner lifts up, it shouldn't be a problem. When I pour in the epoxy, it should work its way into any voids and hold the tiles down that way. That's the first row done. I've got another 5 to go, and to give you an idea, it's taking about an hour for each row. I've cut a couple of spaces to help mark out the next row, and working to that line seems to be working well. Tiles won't line up perfectly, but they should be good enough and make an effective pattern. If there are any that are slightly misaligned, then it will just look a bit more handmade. I've had the idea of making this pattern on a tabletop for a few years, but I've never liked any of the designs that I came up with for the actual table. But I think this one, hopefully anyway, should look pretty cool with a bit of a mid-century look to it. That's one half done, so I'll flip it around and do the other half. I started using a big weight and nudging it along every time I put 3 new tiles down, and that worked really well. Whenever you do a one-off project like I usually do, you figure out best methods along the way, which would be helpful if you ever do it again. But with what I do, that will probably never happen, as I'd always try something new. I'm super pleased with how that's looking. Hopefully I didn't show too much of the process and bored you with it. Now I just need to fill in the end tiles. I marked and cut all of the half tiles individually, which wasn't that bad as there weren't too many of them. I was originally going to use black epoxy between the tiles, but I like how it looks as it is, so I've decided to use clear. Because of that, I need to sand off a few burn marks on the edges of the tiles. There weren't too many of them and it didn't take too long, but it would have been much easier to do before I glued them down. I also sanded off the pencil guidelines on the plywood. I'll put that aside for now and I'll start working on the actual table. I've got a couple of old beams that I've got stored in here, and when I removed this slab, look what I found underneath. It made me jump, even though I'm not really scared of pythons. I just wasn't expecting it, and I reckon they're pretty awesome. Anyway, I carried on and found the reclaimed beams. I got them off a job site that I worked on years ago, and I tried to remove them without bothering the python too much. The wood is super heavy and dense. It's spotted gum as far as I can tell, but IDing wood isn't my strongest area. I'll break it down into more manageable pieces and try and work out if there's going to be enough. It's a good job I had my mask on, as I had the wrong blast gate open on the dust collector. I did think it was looking very hazy in here and there was dust everywhere. I made a template for the legs so I could work out if I could overlap them to get more out of the wood, and it looks like I should just have enough. I knew that my jointer wouldn't be up to planing these boards. It really is super dense, but I had to try. They're pretty flat pieces though, so I'm just going to go for it and put them straight through the thicknesser. The thicknesser has a helical head with inserts, so it works much better than the jointer on this spotted gum. It's looking pretty nice now that I'm into the fresh wood. I still do need to take a bit more off though, but I won't do that with the thicknesser as I'm getting a slight amount of chip out. But it does give me a chance to use a new tool that I haven't used before. I need to give Carbatec and Laguna tools a big thanks for sending me this drum sander. I've wanted one for some time and I reckon it's going to get heaps of use. I don't make many things the size of a table, so generally I think I'll be using the drum sander for smaller projects, but it worked awesome, precisely getting the boards down to the correct thickness and no chip out. I only sanded them to 80 grit, but the sander did a great job. Next I'll joint the edges just like I did with the small camphor pieces at the start of the video, but with a bigger piece of plywood. Once that I cut one straight edge on all the pieces, I flipped them around with the straight edge against the fence and then cut the opposite edge. These pieces will make up the outer edges of the table that will go around the pattern panel. They'll be joined with miters, but before I do that I need to trim down the panel to the final size so I can take measurements from it. Now I'll cut the miters, and I'll do that using the sliding table on the table saw. I could have done it with a miter saw, but this will be more accurate. After I cut one end, I'll mark the other directly off the panel. I'll cut it slightly oversized and then take off small amounts until it fits perfectly. If I did get it wrong and made it too short, because the piece is actually wider than it needs to be, I could run it through the table saw against the fence and take off the smallest amount off the inside edge, which would push the miters slightly away from each other. If you do make miters like this, it's actually a good idea to leave the board slightly wider for this reason, and after the miters have been cut, then rip them down to the final dimensions afterwards. Fortunately, mine turned out perfect and I didn't need to use this method. You may have noticed that the outside corners aren't complete. The outside edge will be shaped all the way around and the corners will be rounded and cut away. I'll be joining the miters with floating tenons, so I'll mark those out now. Before I do cut the mortises for the tenons, I'll glue another piece of plywood to the panel to make it super sturdy. I went for lunch and left the glue to set for about an hour, so now I can route the bottom sheet of plywood flush with the top. Now I'll get back to the joints and I'll put 2 tenons on each miter. I did a test mortise and I did that using my homemade handheld mortiser. Even though I've used it on many projects, it has actually been a while since I've used it, and it's still an awesome machine with amazing dust collection, and for how often I make mortises, this tool is all that I need. It's also a fun project to make. If you're interested, I'll link the build video above and you can find the link to the plans in the description. Miters aren't the ideal joint for a tabletop, but as the panel is plywood and fairly stable, I reckon it will be fine, but wood movement is definitely something to think about. I do a few things on this project that are pushing things, but the table is for us and not a client, so if anything fails, I already have an idea how I'm going to fix them. The brass hammer is already getting a patina and I'm really liking the weight of it. I've been using it a fair bit, and as I said earlier, there's still a few left if you'd like to grab one. Now I'll cut the mortises for tenons to join the table edges to the panel. Before I glue the edges to the panel, I need to shape the outside of the long side pieces. They'll get a gentle curve which will give the table a mid-century look. I'll reuse the piece of plywood that I used earlier to trim and square up the edges of the spotted gum and make a template with it. To get a good and even curve, I'm using a piece of 3mm flat steel bar. I cut it very close to the line, but it still needs some refining, and I keep checking it by putting the flat bar against it, which shows me any areas that need evening out. Next I'll mark onto the side pieces. I'll remove most of the waste on the bandsaw, then use the template with a flush trim bit in the router to finish them. Now I'll cut a bevel on the underside of all 4 edge pieces, and this will give the finished table a lighter look even though it is actually quite a thick top. I started on the end pieces as they were the easiest, being straight. That went well, so now onto the curved pieces. The random helping hand was my son Bradley, who was a bit camera shy. Anyway, the side pieces didn't go so well, as the start of the cut on both pieces I ended up cutting into the outside mortises. I'll continue with the project and use the mortises as they are. I made a few floating tenons out of spotted gum, so if someone puts their head under the table they won't stand out too much, and I'm still happy enough that the joint will be strong enough. I made these clamps in one of my very first videos. They're super handy, as I also made a couple of extra long bars which only take a minute to swap over. Now for the big glue up, which is always a bit stressful, so fingers crossed it goes okay. I need to line up all the tenons and then start working in the edges slowly all the way around. I was rushing that much I didn't even realise that I put one of the ends on upside down with the bevel on the top. That actually went much better than I expected. While the glue sets up on that, I'll start working on the legs. I'll make a plywood template again, and I'm using the same piece of plywood for the 3rd time in this project. I cut it off camera. The only thing I did worth noting was joining the 2 templates together to sand a continuous curve between them. The top and the foot need to be accurate, so I'm cutting those on the table saw again with the sliding table. The rails need an angle cutting on the one end, then I can cut the rest out on the bandsaw. I should also mention that I realise I'm joining end grain to side grain, which is probably asking for trouble, but I've decided to chance it and see how it goes. Next I'll cut miters on the end of the short rails, which will be joined together and also joined to a longer rail later on, and this will all start making more sense as it progresses. The glue is set on the tabletop, so I'll get back to that. I'll take it next door and I'll pour the epoxy so that can have time to set while I keep working on the legs. I have to say I was pretty disappointed with how that looked. I felt like I'd ruined it. The plywood panel just stood out too much, and adding that third species of wood just made it look messy. So I quickly made up my mind to try and salvage it by going with my original plan of black epoxy. And to do that, I'm just going to add black epoxy to the clear that I just poured in. I brushed it over and over through every groove to try and make sure that I mixed it in thoroughly. All I can do now is leave it to sit and hope for the best. It was still soft the next morning, so I sealed off the metal workroom and cranked up the heat. I carried on with the base next door, and I actually had the aircon going in that side. I'll join the leg pieces together first and then route the shape with the template afterwards. The plans for the mortiser include an adjustable fence to make mortises on any angle faces, but for 45-degree angles I like to use this simple jig. I did make a video on this which I'll link above. There's still one thing left to do before gluing them together, and that's to round over the front edge of the legs. I don't want a full round over, I just want to put a curve on it, so I'm using a large round over bit and just using a small section of the cutter. The spotted gum splinters very easily, so any routing I do, I try and do in light passes. That still needs a bit more rounding and blending in, but I'll do that after I've glued the leg pieces together. As I said earlier, this really isn't an ideal joint with the end grain glued to the side grain. If the rail expands too much and breaks the joint, I'll just drill all the way through the leg and then fix them together with long screws and plug the holes. Hopefully it'll be okay though, but time will tell. Next I'll finish rounding over the edge of the legs. The last thing to do before gluing the legs together to make the base is to add some chamfers. And again, I do this with light passes as I don't want a big chunk to blow out at this stage of the project. I just need to finish the chamfers on the feet by hand and they'll be ready to glue together. This isn't the easiest joint to clamp together. I did think about making some angled blocks, but adding a couple of clamps and then clamping across those should do the trick. It wasn't pretty, but I got there with a couple of extra clamps. While that glue's setting, I'll quickly make the centre rail, which is pretty straightforward. I'll cut a second mortise lower down, but while the fence on the mortiser is set at this height, I'll cut the first mortise either end of the centre rail. This joint being end grain to end grain is fine with any wood movement, but if it does fail through stress, then again I'll be able to put long screws through the legs into the rail and cover them with plugs. I honestly don't think it will fail though, but if it does, it's an easy enough fix. That's the base just about done, so back to the tabletop and see if I ruined it. I'll try not to bore you too much with sanding, but I can tell you that I spent many hours at it. There were a few air bubbles, but other than that, it looks great and I'm super happy that I added the black. To fix the air bubbles, I'll try some black CA glue. When I poured the epoxy, I did hit the surface with a blowtorch quite a few times, but in hindsight, I should have gone back to it every so often and done it again. What I did do is lock up the workshop and hope for the best. Anyway, the black CA glue worked a treat. I have to say, I reckon that looks pretty spectacular. Next I'll mark and round the corners of the table with this template that I made off camera. I did think about routing it with a template, but I really don't want any chip out now, so I decided to just sand it to the line. The shape is exactly how I wanted it to look. Next I'll flip it over and finish the bevels underneath. It would be extremely difficult to plane this wood with a hand plane, but this little 12-volt planer went through it with no worries at all. fibre disc on the angle grinder did a great job of smoothing things out, but it did make a mess on my workshop. It's left a coating of dust on everything. I sanded and sanded for hours and hours, getting it ready for finish. To position the legs on the top, I was going to route in pockets for the legs to sit into, but I've decided to glue and nail strips of plywood around the legs instead. I still need to attach the top, so I'll do that with simple L brackets. I just need to chisel out a section of the plywood strips for them to sit into. The brackets were zinc plated, which I stripped with acid and blackened them with cold bluing solution. They won't really be seen, but if you did put your head under the table, they won't stand out as much. For the finish, I'll use hard wax oil, but on the plywood, I'll just use water-based varnish, which I gave 2 coats. I've used other hard wax oils before, but the first time I've used this one with a hardener. I really like how these finishes look and how easy they are to apply, and this one with a hardener is perfect when making videos, as with some finishes it can take days, which can delay the release of the video. The finish has really made it pop. I reckon it looks amazing, and I'm so glad I took the chance with the black epoxy. I haven't decided yet, but I may put a second coat on, but it really does look very good with just the one. I'll give it a couple of days or so to fully dry before I take it over the house. I probably should think about making some chairs too, but I need to have a think about the design. And by the way, Kath loves the table. Hopefully you like it too. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and if you did, you may like this video as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.